You don't have to be in a war zone to be fighting one. For some, it's in the firehouse, in the ER, or in the home they grew up in. PTSD doesn't care where the danger came from. It only cares that your brain felt unsafe. Most people imagine PTSD as a veteran with flashbacks only condition, but that's not true. PTSD can come from car accidents, assaults, abuse, natural disasters, first responder experiences, medical trauma, even sudden loss. Think of any sudden traumatic incident that might occur to somebody in life, and if it affects their brain in the right way or in the wrong way, then it can have lasting effects on the brain and on their nervous system. For example, if someone jumps out of the bushes and assaults you, that's traumatic. It can change the way you look at everything around you. It can change the way you look at taking a walk, the way you look at going outside, the way you look at going to your car. That person might not have a long traumatic history of war or even being a first responder, but that event can still dictate a trajectory in their lives. Or maybe they do have a long history of traumatic experiences. But the point is, it doesn't matter what happened. Because it's not specifically about what happened. It's about how the brain and your body responded to what happened. So the core symptoms of PTSD are re-experiencing, which is when the memory doesn't stay in the past. It pushes its way into the forefronts of your mind or into the present as nightmares, flashbacks, or even just a smell or sound that suddenly takes you back to that time. There's also avoidance, which is when people start organizing their lives around what feels safe to them. So avoiding certain environments, avoiding streets and stores and places, or even entire relationships that could trigger memories similar to something that happened to them. And the reason people do this is to maintain a sense of peace and calm and to protect their peace so that they aren't triggered by the intrusive thoughts or the intrusive memories, and limit exposure to external stimuli that will be upsetting for them. Because often people are then thrown into these negative thought loops, and it's very difficult for them to break out of once they've entered that mental state. Because individuals who suffer from PTSD do have negative changes in thinking and mood. They might experience shame, guilt, self-loathing, self-blame, feeling detached or distant or even numb. Some people describe dissociation. There's also hyperarousal, which is when your brain's smoke detector is on high alert, always scanning for danger. That's why some people with PTSD feel jumpy or irritable or on edge. And often they suffer from insomnia, meaning they aren't able to sleep at night. It's as if their brains can never shut off for very long, or long enough for them to rest at least. And we all know how important rest is to your overall functioning, how important sleep is to your overall functioning. So if somebody's having constant flashbacks and nightmares, it makes it really difficult for them to have a restful night's sleep and then in turn function appropriately like they need to during the day. That's why some people with PTSD have to go on disability and things like that, because it's really hard to maintain a routine when you're in that mindset. Because basically, the amygdala is working overtime. The alarm system goes into overdrive. It rings too loud, too often, and for too long. And then the hippocampus starts to change. The filing cabinet for your memory starts to shrink. So traumatic memories don't get stored properly. We don't know where to put them. They just get tossed over here and tossed over there, and they don't have a place. That makes them feel like they're still happening to your brain. And lastly, the prefrontal cortex starts to change and logic loses out to fear. And we aren't able to filter out those thoughts appropriately anymore. PTSD and your symptoms are not some kind of weakness whatsoever. It's just wiring in your brain. It's neurocircuitry. PTSD is the brain doing its best to survive what feels like unsurvivable circumstances, or what were unsurvivable circumstances. But sometimes it doesn't know how to turn off survival mode, even when there is no immediate danger around you. It just lives in fight or flight mode. Because most people hear PTSD and they picture a veteran with combat flashbacks. That's only one story. PTSD can follow you out of a car crash, into your childhood bedroom, or even out of the ER after saving someone else's life. Because it's not about the event itself. It's about how your brain and your body reacted to it. That's why PTSD looks different for everyone. But underneath, the brain changes allow for the same patterns. And something that's really important to me with this topic of PTSD is the topic of first responders. Because they're at a huge risk in our society, especially with COVID and, years ago, 9/11, just in the 2000s and on, they've been at high risk for PTSD. Firefighters, police officers, EMTs, ER staff are experiencing constant exposure to trauma. And it's looked at like their daily job. It's just their career. It's what they're built for. And I'm not talking about just the big events like the fires and the shootings and the mass accidents, but I'm talking about the sum, the mass total, but the cumulative weight of seeing suffering, death, and danger shift after shift. And that's a thing. And that's the thing about trauma when it snowballs. It's not just one bad call. It's hundreds or thousands of bad calls over the years. And the problem is a lot of people in these fields don't think they need help or don't seek help because they're supposed to be the strong ones. They're the helpers. They're the protectors. They're not the ones being helped. They're not the ones that need protected, right? But everybody needs protected sometimes. And in many departments, mental health care is still stigmatized, meaning you'll be judged if you do seek out therapy for something that happened. And I know that to be true. Seeking help may feel like weakness or even career ending to some people. That silence compounds the trauma. PTSD prevalence in first responders is estimated at 10 to 20% versus 3.5% in the general population. So it's very much increased. And suicide rates among firefighters and police officers are higher than line of duty deaths in some studies. Many develop PTSD symptoms but never receive a single diagnosis. But the truth is, trauma doesn't care if you wear a uniform. PTSD can come from war zones. Yes, it certainly can, but it can also come from a car accident, a violent home, or a sudden loss. And yes, first responders are one lens, but they're only one lens. The human brain responds to trauma in the same ways, no matter the source. And that's the point of this conversation. It doesn't matter what happened. It's how the brain perceived it. It's how the brain experienced it. There are some universal themes with PTSD, which is loss of safety, because the world no longer feels safe or predictable. A car backfiring can feel like gunfire. A dark room can feel like a very dangerous setting. A store or a movie theater can feel like a very dangerous setting. It's like living with the volume turned up on fear, even when nothing's happening. It's like living in fight or flight mode, even when nothing is happening. It's like your body is telling you that you need to be trying to survive right now, even when everybody else around you seems calm or doesn't appear to have a care in the world. Another universal theme is guilt and shame, because survivor's guilt is very common with PTSD. Like, why did I live when others didn't? Which is a really hard responsibility, guilt to deal with. Thinking I should have done more, I should have stopped it, can be very difficult for people. And then, unfortunately, the shame becomes its own type of trauma, often heavier than the original event. Another theme is isolation. Pulling away from family, friends, or partners. Not because you don't love them anymore, but because being close feels unsafe, or because you don't want them to see you for how you feel now or how you think that you look, or to see what's broken inside of you. PTSD has a way of shrinking the world until it feels like you're carrying the weight of it alone. Like you could be in a crowd of 3 million people and you still feel alone. Because nobody can relate to that experience that you had. Because no two traumatic experiences are exactly alike. The core is all the same though. The alarm system that won't turn off. No matter where it comes from, PTSD shares the same type of symptoms. The world no longer feels predictable. And again, the part that breaks my heart the most is how some first responders, or a lot of first responders, are trained to treat horror as routine. Just treat horrific events as routine, like it's just a job. A fatal crash, a house fire, a child who doesn't make it. It gets filed away as just another Tuesday afternoon. Things that would shatter most of us are seen as part of a job. But they're not just calls, they're traumas. They are literally traumas. And when you convince yourself it's nothing, you never give yourself permission to seek help. Recovery looks different for everyone. For one person, it's sleeping through the night again. For another, it's driving past the crash site without panicking and having heart palpitations. For another, it's telling the story out loud for the first time ever. So healing is possible, but it takes the right tools. For some, it means therapy, EMDR, prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, all designed to teach the brain that the danger has passed. to rewire what we have been wired to think and feel. For others, medications help turn down the volume on nights where night terrors, nightmares, and hyperarousal are taking over. Options like SSRIs or Prazosin or sometimes sedatives. And there are new treatments on the horizon, thankfully, from ketamine to nerve blocks for those who haven't found relief elsewhere yet. But as we know, healing doesn't just happen in a therapist's office. It happens every day, everywhere you go, with every choice you make. It happens in the community, in peer groups, in first responder debriefings, in survivor circles where silence finally breaks. And healing doesn't mean erasing the trauma. It doesn't mean forgetting it. It doesn't mean minimizing or dismissing it. It means the memory finally moves into a place in the filing cabinet where it belongs. It means the memory finally moves into the past instead of hijacking the present. For one person that's sleeping through the night, PTSD is still very much misunderstood. Too often it's labeled weakness or brushed off as an excuse, or the situation wasn't extreme enough to be PTSD. In first responder and military culture, silence is baked in. In civilian life, survivors may hear, "just get over it," which invalidates the injury or the traumatic event and what it did to your nervous system. There is limited access because there are long wait lists for trauma-trained therapists that offer the types of services that are needed to heal from these types of traumas. Insurance that covers meds faster than therapy is another issue because, yes, medications have their place, but when you can't combine them with the right therapy, it's often useless. And then when you're living in rural areas, like in Appalachia, where I practice and I have always lived, there's almost no specialized care. Some survivors, like immigrants, BIPOC population, LGBTQ+, face extra barriers like cultural stigma or lack of culturally competent providers. PTSD often gets misdiagnosed as depression, substance use disorder, especially with self-medication, anger issues, or behavior problems, especially in kids, adolescents, and teens. Many people never even hear the words PTSD applied to what they're going through. The old lens should be, what's wrong with you? And the new trauma-informed lens should be, what happened to you? Advocacy is all about teaching systems, police departments, hospitals, schools, courts. We have to teach everyone to see trauma as an injury, not as a flaw. So we need to change the conversation because PTSD isn't rare and it isn't weakness. It's an injury that deserves recognition, treatment, and most importantly, compassion. And as a side note, because I do work in Appalachia, there are higher baseline rates of suicide where I live. In the Appalachian region, the suicide rate is about 17% higher than the national average. So the first responders and veterans living and working in these communities are at higher risk for suicide. And in Appalachia, Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, the national average is 26% higher than in non-Appalachian parts of Ohio itself. Because socioeconomic deprivation like poverty, unemployment, low educational attainment is strongly associated with higher suicide rates in Appalachian counties. Also, geographic isolation, fewer mental health providers, and less access to resources, combined with under-resourced health infrastructure, make prevention and intervention much, much harder. In many Appalachian counties, 14 of the 15 highest suicide rate counties in Ohio are in rural Appalachian areas. The diseases of despair, which include suicide, have been persistently elevated in Appalachia, and the gap between Appalachia and non-Appalachian U.S. widened over the past decade. First responders are known to have elevated suicide risk compared to the general population, though absolute suicide numbers among them are it's not hard to imagine how the risks stack up. Trauma exposure on the job, combined with fewer mental health resources, long travel times to care, and a culture that often says, stay strong and stay silent. PTSD doesn't belong to one group. It can touch anyone from soldiers to survivors, from first responders to ordinary families blindsided by loss. We need to start to normalize and validate and make people understand the brain did what it had to do to keep you alive. In Appalachia, suicide rates are higher than the national average. And when you combine that with the first responder trauma and limited access to care, the silence gets even heavier. That's why these conversations matter to me, because silence costs lives. I want to talk about this topic a lot more, but I thank you for being here, and I'll see you next time. Bye.